All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Elle. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm a reader services librarian at Seattle Public Library. Welcome to an author and artist discussion with Calvin Gimpelovich and Chris Vargas. At the top of our evening tonight, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Indigenous land. It's important for us to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on this land and to seek to understand our place within this history. These are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish. We honor their elders, past and present, and extend gratitude for their stewardship of this land. At the top of our evening tonight, I want to start by saying thank you to our supporters, Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture, the Seattle Public Library Foundation, and the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation. And a big thanks to our media sponsor, the Seattle Times. This event will be recorded, captioned, and then posted on SPL's YouTube channel after the event. Once the author and artist have had an opportunity to speak, there will be a Q&A session allowing you to pick the author and artist's brain. Until then, please hold your questions. Our first speaker this evening is Chris Vargas. Vargas is a video maker and interdisciplinary artist based in Bellingham, Washington, and Los Angeles, California. He earned his MFA from the Art Practice Department at Berkeley in 2011. His work deploys humor and performance to explore the complex ways that queer and trans people negotiate spaces for themselves within a historical and institutional memory and popular culture. He is the executive director of MATHA, the Museum of Transgender in History and Art, a critical and conceptual arts and history institution highlighting the contributions of transgender art to the cultural and political landscape. Chris, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Elle, for that introduction. And thank you to the Seattle Public Library for hosting, and Calvin for inviting me here. I'm going to share with you my project, the Museum of Trans History and Art. I'm going to share some images because I think that's more interesting than looking at me. Before that, I want to just say hi to any Seattle friends who might be in the audience, including some people working at the Seattle Public Library. Lynn's Runyon, if you're out there, and Marcos Chavez. Hi, hope you're well. So yeah, this is a project that I've been doing since 2013. And it started with this poster, the Museum of Trans History and Art. Can you all see? I'm assuming yes. It's a conceptual forever under construction museum. In other words, it doesn't really have a physical space, but it's taken a lot of different forms, such as this first poster that I made back in 2013, a couple other graphics, pronoun showdown on the left and transvestism in the news on the right, which pulls from a photo album of the same name by trans activist Louise Lawrence. And they're all headlines from kind of mid 20th century and before. It's taken the form of performances, mainly as me as executive director, in exhibitions like the couple that I will highlight for you tonight. MATHA is a project that highlights trans art and history, and at its heart, it takes a critical approach to museums and its historic exclusion of marginalized people, specifically trans, gender non-conforming, and non-binary individuals. So this second iteration in the show series that I did took place at the Henry Art Gallery. Obviously the relevance is, the relevance, I'm speaking to a Seattle audience. And this particular exhibition brought together art and archival objects focused on trans history connected to the Pacific Northwest. The installation, that's the entrance to the installation, and then a larger view of it on the right. I'm going to highlight some pieces in the show So some poster graphics, because they're so great. The fine people at the Henry Art Gallery designed this. One of the most exciting pieces was the lampshade crown, made in 1975, made its debut then too. And it's the crown for the Imperial Sovereign Court of Seattle and the Olympic Rainier Empire, which is part of the larger international court system. And the crown was first worn by Dominique Saint Laurent when she was crowned the Empress of Seattle Olympia IV. And then this original version was presented for the last time in 2006 to Alexa Manila. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her, when she was crowned Her Most Imperial Sovereign Majesty, the Empress of Seattle Olympia the 35th. And this is them upon Manila's coronation in 2006. And then when Manila stepped down, the very fragile crown was retired after 31 years of use. This next work is by Reese Ernst. It's a video letter to the late San Francisco activist and author and possibly first out gay trans man, Lou Sullivan. And he died of AIDS in 1991 at the age of 39. While he wasn't a resident of Seattle, his book, Information for the Female to Male Crossdresser and Transsexual, was published by the Ingersoll Gender Center, who boasts, in Seattle, who boasts the longest continuously running weekly support group, which has occurred every Wednesday night for over 40 years without ever missing a week. And now, I don't know if they're back, but they were on Zoom for the last couple of years. I'm not sure if they're back in person though. Materials from the Ingersoll, it was exhibited, including the mirror that you see on the left, originally belonging to founder Marcia Botzer's family, that hung in the organization's various locations since 1977. Other stories included Harry Allen or Harry Livingston, given name Nell Pickerel. So you'll see that name in a lot of the clippings related to this, articles related to this person, who was born in 1982, who was an infamous figure in the Northwest. Harry was assigned female at birth, but donned the attire and lifestyle of a more masculine gender. And the 45 news articles in a 30-minute video that I compiled for the exhibit span 20 years and chronicle Harry Allen's life as an adventurous heartbreaker whose continuous run-ins with the law point to the history of criminalization of transgressive genders, as well as the media's fascination with the subject. Another work by Lorenzo Trebergo along the same similar topic explores trans and queer identities in the context of mass incarceration. And the figure Liz drapes, together with aerial views of landscape, serve as kind of meditations of the public absence of those most vulnerable to criminalization within the trans community, mainly people of color, trans women, poor people, and people who are mentally ill or who are disabled. And then there was a couple iterations in the show series. One took place at the Portland Art Museum. Since it was also in the Northwest, I didn't take a regional approach to this. And instead, I kind of wanted to mimic a trans video store. So this was a screening room of 9 looping experimental trans film and video works. And then in the space were 90 drawings of trans movies that range from all kinds of different genres and types of makers, gender, trans identifying and non, but trans related nonetheless. And another show took place at the new museum that focused on Stonewall. And this is just a couple images of that installation. And then I'll just show you more in depth this iteration of the Motha exhibition series, which took place at the Oakland Museum of California in a larger show called the Queer California Untold Stories exhibition. And I drew this facade, which was modeled after the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I also did drawings for the wallpaper inside, which you can see in this image. And yeah, on display was all kinds of artwork and archival materials related to gender nonconforming or gender transgressive or trans identifying individuals in the Bay Area. like Sylvester, Lou Sullivan, the performance troupe, the Coquettes, Louise Lawrence, Miss Major, Compton's Cafeteria, but these images focus on the Latinx material in the installation. So Jose Sadia was, and material related to the Black Cat Cafe, which was opened in 1906, and it was a notorious gathering spot for gay clientele post World War II in the Bay Area. And Jose Sadia was did drag performances there, which became a regular attraction. And it was also the headquarters for Sadia's campaign for city supervisor. And Sadia in 1965 also was the founder of the Imperial Court System, which I just mentioned before, related to materials in the Henry Show. So Imperial Court System is, if you don't know, is a pageant organization still active with a ton of chapters all over North America. And this I'm a Boy badge, this was worn at the Black Cat Cafe by the drag performers, or the performers there, in defiance of the anti-cross-dressing laws that allowed police to harass and arrest anybody not wearing clothing aligned with their assigned sex at birth. So this included drag queens and trans people. And another work, this series called Q-Sides by Vero Mahano, Amy Martinez, and Carrie Orvik. It's a queer reimagining of the album covers of the East Side Story LPs that originated in East LA in the late 70s and 80s. These are Bay Area based artists, so not fully at Southern California, but the iconic bootleg compilations of 60s soul and R&B became a soundtrack for predominantly heteronormative Chicano lowrider culture. But the Q-Sides bring a kind of queer retelling of that. And images are of various people in the Bay Area, performers like Persia, Dulce de Leche, Boy Young. I believe that's who's in the car, in the truck on the left. This is reference images of those original LPs that the series is referencing. So they're kind of one-for-one recreations. And then Viva 16, which is a really great documentary about queer Latinx culture in the Mission in the 1990s. And it's centered around the bar Esta Noche. I'm not going to show you a clip, but you can find it on YouTube. It's pretty great. The bar and cabaret was a safe haven for queer and trans Latinx community in San Francisco, who might have felt out of place in the predominantly white Castro district. In 1997, it was the only Latino-owned bar on 16th Street, and then due to rising costs in that city, it announced its closing. It was kind of gentrified out of existence in 2014. Yeah. This would be an image of a still from the film, but I'm gonna advance. Oh, here we go. Yeah. You can find that on YouTube. It's so great. I highly recommend it. And yeah, these exhibitions were part of a larger series called Trans History in 99 Objects. And it is now a project that I'm working on in book form. So kind of expanding out from what I was able to show in the exhibitions. And yeah, look out for that. That's mainly what I'm working on now. And I will stop sharing. Thank you so much for allowing me to present on this. And I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A.
Thank you, Chris. Really looking forward to seeing that book with 99 objects. That looks fascinating. Thank you. Our second speaker tonight is Calvin Gimpelovich, the author of the fiction novel Invasions, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, a recipient of the Lambda Literary Award. His work has been recognized by Artist Trust, the Jack Straw Cultural Center, For Culture, Codex and Writer's Block, the Kimmel Harding Nelson Center for the Arts, and is forthcoming in Plowshares Magazine, the Kenyon Review, and Electric Literature. Calvin, take the floor.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Especially thank you so much, Chris, for coming. And to the Seattle Public Library, who has been so incredibly supportive of everything I've thrown at them over the last half a decade or so. So I'm very happy to be here on their official Zoom channel in my friend's house. And I'm working on a book right now. I'm working on a fictional book based on the historical figure Queen Christina of Sweden, who was a 17th century monarch of Sweden and has fallen a little bit out of gossip at this point in history. But apparently there's a very famous Greta Garbo movie starring Queen Christina that a lot of people have seen. But for a couple hundred years after Christina's life and rule and during, gossip like crazy. And so much of this was circled around lesbian, not a lesbian, asexual, not asexual, seemed to have relationships with women, maybe had a relationship with a man, lots of cross-dressing. And personally, I think looking over Christina's life, looking over the documents, the statements made, all of this makes a lot more sense from a trans perspective. And so I'm working on a novel right now that is viewing Christina through that lens. And I'm going to read the opening of that book. So that's the context. This is a very early draft. It's a much earlier draft than I would usually share. So feel free to email me your comments because it's going to be edited. Alexander the Great was born 356 years before Christ, and Christina's mother tried to kill her before she was a week old. Olympias, Alexander's mother, dreamt on the night of her marriage's consummation that a thunderbolt struck her womb, causing flames to spread over the land. The temple of Artemis, one of the world's 7 wonders, burned on the day of his birth. The goddess was too busy attending his entry to keep her own temple from being destroyed. Christina entered the world on a winter's night, covered from head to toe in light hair. She had a strong voice and a caul, a piece of amniotic sac obscuring her torso. The midwives pronounced her a male. In candlelight, buffeted by their own exhaustion, by the entire kingdom's wishful thinking, and astrological assurances of the baby's gender, it was the best they could do. The queen wept with relief, finally, a living boy, as attendants washed the royal stickiness from her thighs and escorted her to a clean bed. The king rejoiced from his own room, recovering from fever, and the rest of the castle followed, drinking themselves into a stupefied, happy slumber as snow beat on the fortress-like walls. The first prince and princess were stillborn. The queen's second daughter was sickly and died before her first year. The midwives were so relieved to deliver a healthy princeling, so distracted by the caul and hair, that it took several hours to identify the swollen vulva for what it actually was. In the dark morning, one of these panicked women fetched the king's sister, Catherine, and begged her to deliver the news. She did this by bringing the baby naked to her brother and sovereign, so he could see with his own eyes what no one else had the courage to say. The king sat up, still in bed, and examined the furry, wrinkled primate that had come from his seed and already disappointed so many expectations, making a grim face before taking her into his arms. She is undoubtedly going to be clever because she's already made fools of us all. When Catherine looked up, he was smiling, kissing the little girl's head. She began to reassure him, telling him the queen was still young and could try again, but the king silenced her. "Let us thank God, my sister. I am content. This girl will be worth as much to me as a boy." He ordered a Te Deum sung for Thanksgiving and all of the celebrations befitting a male heir. The queen proved less flexible. After being allowed to rest several days with illusions intact, a nursemaid showed her the child. All of the queen's happiness and triumph drained to a deadened, terrified patch. Instead of a son, I am given a daughter, dark and ugly with a great nose and black eyes. Take her from me, I will not have such a monster. Before anyone knew what she was doing, the queen's hand closed around the infant's windpipe, squeezing as the baby screamed and her ladies wrenched them apart. Her face colored with righteous fury. The queen shouted that if they ever showed her that monster again, she would carve a hole in the ice and throw it into the sea. Olympias, Alexander the Great's mother, like Christina's mother, was a princess who married a king for political ties. Unlike her mother, Olympias was an iron political player who orchestrated her son's rise to power and slept with snakes in her bed. Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, queen consort of Sweden, was an attractive, spoiled woman who never reconciled herself to exile from the comforts and culture of her family's court in Berlin. She dressed in the latest mainland fashions with enormous lace ruffs and sleeves attached to colorful silks and velvets embellished with gold thread, gemstones netted over her hair, in elaborate beadwork dresses, unlike anything the sober Swedish nobles had witnessed before. She'd not realized when the handsome, gallant king asked for her hand that he was the only civilized man in his country, that his love of art and music, the 5 languages he spoke, his graceful dancing and brusque yet proper manners made him the pinnacle of northern sophistication. He was a big blonde man, as powerful as a Viking, who handled her like porcelain, literally the only Swedish person whose company she could stand. The rest were so stupid and backwards, as likely to rob merchants as barter with them, that she didn't even learn bothering to speak their crude tongue. The queen used French and her native German, primarily with her own ladies, imported with her from Berlin. There were other complaints. The food, for example, fish and rubbery cow. She'd rather live on bread and water in a cultured place than Sweden's royal fare. They had no lovely buildings, no theater to speak of, no balls or entertainment, coarse wooden furniture in the noblest houses, no tapestries or paintings, just bare walls and floors and the interminable cold. The grim gray Stockholm castle, better suited to medieval fortification than their enlightened age. It was all farmland, lakes and forests. The men still tested their courage by hunting and fighting with bears. She sent a servant boy to learn the arts of marzipan, pastries, and German confections at her family's court, which brought her some joy. But no servant could ameliorate the Nordic winter, where the sun hardly rose 6 hours a day, or the summer, which natives found compensatory, where the hours reversed, the light lasted too long, she couldn't sleep, and it wasn't hot, but only a little bit less cold. Her pleasures were limited to the pastry boy, her husband, and the rare ambassador capable of appreciating her charms. The Swedes hated her as much as she hated them. If Maria Eleonora had a central virtue beyond her face and perfect manners, it was devotion to her husband. She loved him. He was nearly always at war. During these absences, she could hardly leave bed. Anxiety choked her waking thoughts, followed by crushing despair. She spent her time weeping and begging the Lord High Chancellor to write the king and make him return. She said that as soon as she knew her beloved Lord was coming, all her sickness and panic vanished, but the Chancellor refused to help her. If she tried to cheer herself with food or gifts or parties, he lectured her about draining the treasury, and when she cried too much about her own mother's passing or the children she lost, he told her to cultivate the kind of regal stoicism Swedes expected, the way the previous queen, the king's mother, had. She visited her family as often as she was allowed. Maria's last pregnancy was difficult, the labor painful, her nerves not up to the task. She feared that her husband had tired of her, that he found her less beautiful than at their marriage, and that the infinite wars with Denmark and Poland were an excuse to leave her alone. She worried that he hated her for not fulfilling her duty of bearing an heir. Sweden, like Brandenburg, was a fiercely Protestant territory surrounded by Catholics who wanted their throne. If her husband died without a successor, his cousin, the King of Poland, would press his claim, push Catholicism on him, and spark civil war. Nothing could make her husband love her better than providing the requisite son. Astrologers promised that this fourth child would grow to be a great king. She did everything in her power to make that happen, confining herself in the castle, sitting before its great fires, bundled against the least chill. She compressed every ounce of strength into filling her duty. And yet, when beautiful Maria Eleonora saw her ugly daughter, it seemed that those intentions had turned against her, and a devil had formed in her womb. The feats of Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden's warrior king, did not equal an Alexander, but more than sufficed for Alexander's predecessor and father, Philip II of Macedon. Like Philip, Gustavus led his own armies, inspired them with his own martial prowess instead of sitting in front of the map behind a heavy guard. Like Philip, he had improved these armies' strategies and weapons to the reward of a nearly undefeated record abroad. Philip united the Macedonians and Greeks against Persia. Gustavus meant to unite the Protestant states of Europe against the Catholics bent against them. The king was tall, broad, passionate, blunt, happiest in the clarity of the saddle, and prone to fits of despair. His hair had the tawny coloring of a lion. His eyes were blue, his skin perpetually reddened from weather, but naturally pale. His dynasty had freed the peasants from Catholic serfdom and forced the nobility to grant them concessions, which earned their perpetual thanks. He treated himself like a common soldier, sleeping in the same tents, sweating in summer, freezing in winter, killing, getting sick, getting injured, and starving beside his men. No part of the military was elevated above the others, no officer too precious to bear a lesser man's arms. He himself preferred the simple clothing of a soldier, barely distinguishing himself with a scarlet cloak or sash that disappeared in the fray. His chief counselor and friend, the Lord High Chancellor, often begged him to consider his person. But what was the good of a king in a box, of preserving himself like a maiden before her wedding? The only bullet that could kill him was one God specifically chose. Philip II had 7 wives, Gustavus Adolphus had 1. If Maria Eleonora had plotted against Gustavus's life, the way Philip's wives did, he would have found their relationship easier. Once an Italian mercenary in his army had been paid by another ruler to shoot him. Every time the man drew his weapon, his hands shook too much to fire. The soldier's heart turned to lead. The king's popularity, assurance, and courage placed the would-be assassin under his spell. Gustavus Adolphus did not fear them, but his wife's excessive attachment stumped him. He felt that he was drowning in honey, that no matter how much he fought, a sweet, sticky substance enveloped his blade. She was, he confided to the Lord High Chancellor, a very sick woman. They had to treat her like a child with infinite care. After the attempted strangulation, Maria Eleonora begged his forgiveness, not for the attempted infanticide, but for failing to give him a son. She was the only woman he'd met whose weeping did not make her less attractive. Her cheeks flushed, but her face didn't blotch or turn red. What was there to do but take this delicate woman, so slight that one of his hearted martial breaths could blow her away, into his comforting arms? He told her that they must be grateful and patient, that God had his reasons for gifting a daughter, and love would soon bloom in her heart. Gustavus named Christina after his mother, hoping to strengthen her Swedish bloodline until it absorbed and defeated whatever Maria Eleonora's contribution might bring. It cheered him to see that the infant had absorbed little of her mother's good looks, showing only Maria Eleonora's oversized eyes. He hoped that he'd also avoided the queen's physical frailty and indecision, to say nothing of the insanity that ran in his wife's recent ancestral line. By christening, Christina's fur had shed, and she looked like a normal child. The queen was too ill to attend. The next day, in a supposedly freak accident, a huge beam fell on the baby's cradle, shattering it into 1,000 pieces, narrowly missing the girl. Later, one of Maria Eleonora's women dropped her onto the stone castle floor. Miraculously, the child survived, but one of her shoulders was crushed beyond the point of repair. The queen comforted the offending nursemaid, who was inconsolable, she said at the error, with money and some of the sweetmeats she kept on reserve. Gustavus decided to have his daughter fostered before any more mishaps occurred. At what point did Alexander become great, or Gaius Julius Caesar, more than a member of an ancient but not especially influential patrician clan? When did any of the Christian kings of Europe become more than another coddled, scheming princeling who might die without seeing a crown? Christina's story began, to herself, the day God provided her a throne. She'd been living with her Aunt Catherine's family for more than 2 years. This included her aunt's German husband, the Count Palatine, and a bevy of cousins, her favorites being Charles and Maria Euphrosyne, who was almost exactly her age. The Palatines had been made refugees, their fortunes wrecked by the war Gustavus Adolphus was fighting in now. They celebrated each of the king's victories as a blows towards their restoration, expressing gratitude in the devotion they brought to Christina's care. Charles Gustav did this by always letting her win. Christina was 6, Charles was 10. They had mountains of metal soldiers set up over the furniture and on the beds. Today, Christina was Caesar, Charles the barbarian chieftain of Gauls. Caesar would win, and Charles, playing coward, would let the future Roman emperor chase him around their quarters, eventually stabbing him in the neck. A squat, stolid boy, he worshipped Christina's father and dreamt of earning his own laurels in battle someday. Caesar was stomping on a regiment of Gallic soldiers when the Count Palatine entered and knelt before the shocked girl. The Princess Catherine followed, crying, with her eldest daughters in tow. None of the children had seen her crying before. Still kneeling, the Count kissed Christina's hand. "Your Majesty." He had tears in his eyes. "We've just received word that your father is dead." Christina also started crying, more from shock than any memory of the man. Charles sank to his knees. She had a vague recollection of a big man standing next to her in front of many other somber men, the Parliament, where she'd given a little speech. Gustavus Adolphus had lifted her onto his shoulders. She was 4 years old, and the men were swearing their allegiance to her as the king's successor as he departed for war. Since then, her concept of him had fused with an oil portrait hanging in the main hall and a larger-than-life-size bronze head. When her aunt helped her draft letters, it seemed she was writing to them. At the word "dead," she imagined the portrait torn into 1,000 pieces, the bust crumpled, and asked to see them. The entire Palatine family gathered in front of the bronze to pay their respects. Christina stopped crying. Everything looked as it always had, except other nobles, men and women she never talked to, were stopping, kneeling, and kissing her hand. Destiny filtered through her. For the first time, she realized her difference. Kingship settled on her. Queens had no business ruling Sweden. That title referred to the wife or mother of a reigning monarch. Maria Eleonora had less right to the throne than the Princess Catherine or even young Charles Gustav. Gustavus Adolphus's gift was expanding that kingship's gender. He declared his daughter an heir. No woman had ever led Sweden, but the female Elizabeth I of England had recently set precedent for successful Protestant reign. Christina's early portraits were modeled on the Virgin Queens, with similar high lace collars and matching styles of hair. Elizabeth held her palm over a globe, symbolic of power. One chubby, childish hand. That's the excerpt I've got now. Elle, do you want to introduce the next segment?
Yes, thank you, Calvin. I was riveted. I lost track of time. Thank you so much for that reading. Yes, this brings us to the Q&A portion of the event. And we're actually going to kick it off with a question directed towards Chris by Calvin. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. So I want to take the chance to say that I've been a very big fan of Chris's work since I saw Martha at Henry and managed to see the show at New Museum and heard you on Benjamin Walker's Theory of Everything. And I'm so happy you're here. I'm really very happy that you agreed to do this. And I've been thinking a lot about Martha since starting the research for this project, because 17th century Sweden had different gender norms than we do now. And Christina, again, I think in all of the stuff I read, the facts are all true. Any actual dialogue is actual recorded. Her dad said that stuff, mom said that stuff. And Christina's writings later on as an adult oscillate between being like, I have nothing in common with women, women are stupid, but very misogynistic, I'm a man. And then writings being like, people accuse me of being a hermaphrodite, it's obviously not true, I'm a woman, my doctor knows. And I feel pretty comfortable retroactively saying that if this person with this same gender behavior and presentation was put into the current era, I think they would be a member of the trans community. But dealing with somebody in context, way more challenging, even just dealing with the pronouns and how those shift throughout this book has been something I've been thinking a lot about. So I, with that very long lead up, want to hear, Chris, how you've been dealing with that and what your thoughts are about kind of retroactively putting gender theory on these historical figures.
Yeah, congratulations. What an awesome project, your book. But thanks for the question. Yeah, it's something I foreground in looking at the past. It's one of the complications of it, right? I think different form, obviously we know language, the language that we use to describe trans identities is fairly new. It's even the understanding of gender as separate from sexuality is fairly new within, like, I'm gonna get this wrong, but I would say more than 5 decades, it's, I mean, 6 decades new, 5, I don't know. Anyway, but like the popular understanding of that is fairly new. Right, gender, if you had like a weird sexuality, it was your gender too. Thinking about like sexual inverts, this term, related to people who desired, like who had like a homosexual kind of identity. It was like, oh, you are automatically kind of transed in some kind of way. But anyway, yeah, it's something that I think about because language is so tricky. It's the language we use is so contemporary. It really frames our understanding of the subject. But I also don't think that it should stop one from looking and kind of thinking about trans or gender nonconforming or non-binary individuals in the past. But I think that foregrounding that awareness that the language that we're using is contemporary and the people that we're referring to might not have access, they didn't have access to that language and may or may not have identified with it, So, and the fact that the language really understands one in relation to community and the relationship with themselves as embodied and emotional people, it's so different. Like Queen Christina wouldn't like have understood him, her, themselves in ways that we could even imagine because of the shifting language. I even think about in my lifetime, or even actually to even narrow that, like the lifetime of my project, which was started in 2013, and that's almost 10 years ago. But what trans meant in 2013 is so different than what it means now. And I'm thinking about like just the shifting and the introduction of terms like non-binary, which I think, at least in my understanding, like kind of took the place of what transgender used to mean, which was like a really expansive view, an umbrella term, as people used to call it, like for a lot of people inhabiting transgressive genders. And so now maybe trans, for some people, think like would associate the identification of trans as something that maybe in the past would have been akin to the term transsexual, right? Like it's just the terms shift, they mean different things over time. And I think, I mean, ethically, one has to acknowledge that, as you have as you do, even just in your question, I know you're thinking about that, but it also can't stop one from kind of grappling or recuperating these interesting figures from the past that I think help to historicize this experience, you know? Yeah. What do you, I mean, I would love to hear what you're thinking about, or like how you think about that in relation to your work too.
I mean, so I have such a complex about working. I really love that line between fiction and nonfiction, but where you're allowed to fictionalize, which is clearly, you know, a very old discussion, and I'm, you know, glad that fiction is put before it, feels more ethical, but I still have the urge to like cite all of my sources in doing this. And so far in this, I've kept it really close to the reality, like all this stuff. And Christina's life was crazy, but a lot of the pronouns has really been the intro of having to engage with that. Christina has recently, I've been seeing trans historians and people doing projects have been using they, them pronouns, saying that this person was probably trans or non-binary. And I think that makes sense for a nonfiction project, but I just don't think I can put that in this fictional because gender neutral pronouns just don't exist here, or don't exist in any way that I know about. And I don't understand the Swedish or French languages well enough to know, but I know that they're gendered languages. And so in like some ways it's an opportunity because it's a place to play in it. But I made the choice because for most of Christina's life, Christina used she, her, and used the name Christina to stay consistent with the quotations in the documents, to also use that, but kind of break it open at points. And I feel a little, you know, I have some guilt of putting baggage on people who no longer live, and wanting to do right by them, but knowing that you're also, you know, if you're fictionalizing somebody's life, you're kind of inherently reaching very far into them and you are taking liberties. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, I think there's so much freedom in, you know, that like artists have and fiction writers have. And also like a duty. Like, so you have freedom and a duty, and it sounds like you're doing like due diligence for this figure. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I love that the act of like recuperating a story from history while foregrounding one's like investment in them as people and their history and who they are in history, and your I don't know your like particular interest in them. I think I did, like before Moth, I did a lot of biographical kind of projects too, and that was kind of my approach, in that like I foregrounded my investment and in them as individuals, in my identification with them, or my desire for them to be a certain way, you know, and my desire to like look for role models, but know that like it's a complicated project to look into the past and try to lay on these contemporary conceptions of gender and contemporary language on people who don't have the choice to or don't consent to being addressed that way.
The first like trans historical revisitations I saw were the late Leslie Feinberg's. I can't remember the title anymore, but a book or multiple books.
Transgender Warriors, I think. Was that it? Yeah.
Definitely Transgender Warriors. And I wasn't curious about this at the time because I was 19, but now I'm really curious about, you know, how Feinberg felt revisiting that. And I can't ask them because they passed on, but I can ask you, like, have you and Martha gone back and kind of claimed anybody in the community who you're not sure if they would have identified?
Oh yeah. That's the whole project.
Yeah, I'm so curious like how that decision making goes for you and how you feel about that.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about that constantly, and I know, like, I just put forth, like, look, this, not everybody contained within these projects under the Museum of Trans History and Art, like, would have identified as trans, or even if they had access to the terms at that time or the contemporary terms at that time. But I just take an expansive approach. Like, I guess within the framing of the project, I think like of just gender transgression in really wide general terms, acknowledging that trans is limiting. Like, and I like the term trans is limiting because it means, it obviously calls to mind something, but I have to call it something. You know, I have to call the museum something. So, I mean, because also it's a project that it's critical of museums. It's running into all the problems of museums too. And that like, once you name something, you're beholden to that name, and then times change and institutions are so hard to change. And like, it's sort of, I don't know, it's living that life out. And but yeah, like I'm thinking about that show in The Disco Performer, who was a gay man, identified as a gay man, but whose gender was really like awesome, like super flamboyant, really like this performer persona that was like really like glitzy and glittery. And I think anybody whose gender, it says my internet is unstable, so hopefully you all are hearing this. Whoever, like, who, I'm just thinking about gender heroes. If you have a transgressive gender and somebody has named you as their gender icon or hero, like, you can be included under or within the projects of Martha, you know, knowing that it's complicated.
I feel like I could just keep asking things forever. I'm wondering, Al, is there anybody who's sending us Q&A questions that we should answer from the internet?
So far, you're doing good. People are really liking the dialogue between the two of you, finding it fascinating.
Just flag us if somebody has a question.
Oh, of course.
Have questions. One comment is, I think that Archigram did this. I'm not positive, and I think it was in the late 60s. But there was this piece they did pumping the rarefied air of museums out through the windows. There's a big bellows in the middle of this very old institutional museum. And then it had a pipe that went out the window, and there was a little hook like that on the outside. And people could pump, I believe it was interactive, the bellows, to push the rarefied museum air into the outside. And I always think about that with Martha's lack of a permanent space. I feel like that dialogue.
Yeah, I love that project. I don't know about that project. I love it. It's
So
what is who is the artist or
I'm pretty sure it was Archigram. If it wasn't Archigram, because I was reading about these at the same time, it might be House Rococo.
I love this. I'll probably ask you to send that to me again because I'm not writing it down correctly. But yeah,
I'll find a picture of it.
yeah, playing with the like exclusivity of museums is pretty fun. Poking fun at it. But yeah, I mean, in terms of telling or engaging with trans history, yeah, what other projects for you, Calvin, you feel like that you've done in the past have informed the way you're approaching your project now? The Queen Christina, or I guess it's done, it's out there in the world, your most recent writing.
When I started writing more seriously, coincided very neatly with when I was transitioning socially and medically. And that wound up being the short stories and invasions, and then another book that I have in submission. And those were so much like the stuff in invasions is so much about gender and trans things and engaging with that I got. And I was exploring and when I look at them, I don't know if other people could tell, but when I look at them, I can tell that I was really trying to figure some things out when I was writing that, and I was playing with things and what means what. And like so many people, when they're early in transition, when the young part of transition, regardless of your age, you don't know what's important yet. And I see this especially with all the people in my community who are non-binary, really so many things to discover. I don't want to say choices to make as you're realizing what matters. And I was figuring out what matters in presenting, what matters, or like starting to pass, not pass. Do I want a dick? Do I care? The things you have to ask in second puberty. And then I got sick of it and didn't work on anything trans related for years and got obsessed with architecture and urban planning, so again, that kind of stuff, which I know about Archigram. And then after that gap, coming back and looking at gender again, it was really nice because now I feel pretty settled. And so I'm not in that questioning place. So in my now pedestal of personal security, revisiting things, in a way, I feel like I have a much clearer eye. And so that's a lot of this project for me, I think, is going back. And I don't need to deal with my angst. I can deal with Christina's angst.
That's awesome. Yeah, I
I
don't
hope
like.
this is a good segue into, we just received a question and I wasn't sure if that was related to what your response was, but one attendant asked, what is it that inspired both of you to do what you do?
I think neuroses is a good answer for me. So, but yeah, that answers a lot of that for me.
Yeah, I'm interested in trans history, just more generally, queer history, activist history, related to queer and trans identities, and then being an artist and like thinking about museums and contemporary artist relationship to the cultural capital that museums can bestow upon artists, and how, you know, it's an exploitative system. It's built on white cis patriarchy, like in colonialism, like most institutions in this country. So it's fraught, you know, so one's, you know, it's complicated to have an investment in like being acknowledged and supported as an artist by these fraught museums and institutions, but also yeah, the precarious art, like life of an artist, you know, like makes it so that you are tied to that. And, you know, what does that mean? So for me, thinking about that, this is a time when trans people were getting a lot of recognition when I started the project in institutions like that. Academia, you know, the art world, mass media. It was like pre-trans Tipping Point, which was heralded in 2013 when Laverne Cox was on the Time magazine cover, and there was an explosion of trans representation out there. And so thinking for me, I was just like really, really interested in what it was gained and lost by the assimilation of a marginalized identity into institutions that have historically been exclusionary to a lot of different people, a lot of different kinds of people with identities and abilities. So I was like, you know, use this project to kind of take a critical eye at that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. And celebrate a ton of history and art that I'm like in love with and I'm invested in.
I don't know if you relate to this at all, Chris, but I've also just looking back now that like got enough of something that I feel like I can call it a career, and seeing, you know, when I was first publishing, no one was publishing anything trans related at all. Like I don't want to just go off my skill level, but the other trans writers I knew, just nothing mainstream. It was only being shown in queer publishing. And so like the first things I published were with Topside Press, which is specifically trans small press. And it's legitimizing to have those, and creating those things, you start creating this body of work in this subculture of museums and publishing and presentations. And eventually mainstream things are like, oh, okay, you've got enough credentials that we can look at you. And, you know, I feel like that Martha has been doing that in some ways. I felt that because the first time I engaged with you guys was helping run Queer Trans Art Collective in Seattle, Lion's Mane Art Collective. And your panel was the first time we got invited to speak at like a more legitimate institution, which made our next grant application go a lot better.
It's wild how that stuff builds on it. And part of my project was always like wanting to kind of like jam my foot in the door to allow like access to other people, like showing other people's art, like highlighting other people's work, historic, like their scholarship, to activism in these institutions. Because for some reason, I mean, because of the historical context in which I started the project, like my project was very attractive to institutions and they can absorb like a large amount of critique. So why not like just do that and then like try to help, or, you know, like I didn't want it to just be my work. I mean, that's not what this project was about. It was highlighting history and work of other people like you and the collective that you were a part of in Seattle. And that was always like, yeah, a great, like the most like meaningful thing about this project for me in working with institutions.
We have another question. This person asks, what artists inspire both of you? What books and artists have been meaningful to you?
Oh my gosh. You start, Calvin. I'm going to make a list.
Oh my God, that's such a big question. I don't know where to start. I'm also afraid that my answers are very uncool, because I do have a love for the like dead people literary canon. I first fell in love with literature through the kinds of things that they assigned us in English class and in high school, reading, you know, Dostoevsky and stuff. But there's so many contemporary writers who I would much rather plug than the dead ones, who are working really well. And going down that line with not a good answer prepared, I'd have to say, you know, a lot of the writers I met working through Topside a decade ago are doing such wonderful work, and it's been really inspiring for me. You know, Tori Peters has blown up recently, and that's been really wonderful seeing the mainstreaming of, you know, a very, very trans book just everywhere. I'm always a big fan of Casey Plett's work, who just came out with a new short story collection that's looking really good. And I want to say just like whoever Lambda is, spotlighting recently is usually an exciting author. That's what I got off the cuff.
I know, that's such a good question. And the most difficult to like recall and at this for a moment, because Tori Peters, what a star, just ascended in the middle of the pandemic. It was the book that everyone was reading, Detransition Baby. Writers, I guess maybe I'll just focus on writers and then go from there. Jackie S., who wrote this book, Daryl, that I just read. It's fantastic. Writer, the story is based in rural Oregon. I'm not sure if she spent time there, but so great. Jordy Rosenberg, who wrote Confessions of a Fox, I really, really loved. Imogen Binnie, I never say no, who wrote Nevada, so great. And then tons of like older performers and artists like Candy Darling, one of the Warhol superstars, along with Hollywood Lawn, and Greer Langton, who was this amazing sculpture artist who did all these really amazing dolls installations. Colleague, friend Nikki Green, who was a ceramics artist, amazing. Tuesday Smiley. Just think of artists who I've featured, who I was able to show in lots of exhibitions too. Felix Gonzalez Torres, Ana Mendieta. I don't know. There's so many, like, I don't know. Those are the ones that just kind of came out of the top of my head. ACT UP, like the activism of Grand Fury, the graphic collective within ACT UP. They're amazing and totally effective graphic art activism amid the AIDS crisis. Yeah.
Somebody showed me the movie Female Trouble, I think when I was 18, which is Divine and John Waters. And I can't, like, in good conscience recommend it because it's so jacked up. But I also do.
John Waters is like my all-time. It was not, the term problematic wasn't quite in usage when I came into contact with a lot of this work, but totally trashy punk DIY.
I saw that movie and it ended and I felt dirty. Like I was like, what did I just see? I was 18, I didn't know anything.
Yeah.
And then I couldn't stop thinking about it, and a week later showed it to my brother, I think. And then had to just keep rewatching it. I think it altered the course of my life.
Yeah, I know. That gave me like queer possibilities when I saw early John Waters when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, okay.
It's like, turns out you can do anything in the world.
I know.
Anything.
I know. And another performer, Vaginal Cream Davis, in LA, was a performer and artist. Oh my gosh. Who I remember seeing when I was a teenager. Must have had a fake ID, I don't know. But like amazing LA, like performance artist. Incredible person. Yeah.
We have another question, and this is for Calvin. How close does the point of view get to Christina's? Do you go into her own thoughts about her gender?
Yeah, the book, as I'm planning it now, is going to stay in third person. The excerpt I read was a kind of distant third person, and there are parts that are, I think, maybe more queer relevant, but not polished enough that I wanted to share yet, that get into a really, really close third person and into their thought process and viewpoint. So yeah, it will happen.
And I guess I have a question. What advice would you have for trans creatives looking towards the future and creating and trying to communicate with their environment?
Like I was saying about, alternate support and institutions, that has been really, really a foundation for me, and I think for a lot of other people. Looking there, it's such a fertile and rich time right now where that's so accessible and there are so many venues, and I would really encourage people to seek that out because feedback is so important to growing and understanding and feeling legitimate in what you're doing. And then we can pull each other up, and we do. And so that's where I would go.
Yeah, I would say like one's creative community, the people who you feel aligned with aesthetically, politically, emotionally, your friends, your lovers, your colleagues, like these are the people that are most important in my creative world. And I think in everybody, I think when I teach and I see like a lot of students get so much more and push themselves and so much more and get so much more out of community or engagement with their peers and community engagement, even outside of institutions too. Like what I would say, do what you're doing and find the community who are also doing it too, and people will eventually recognize that if you want, outside validation and recognition, because it's nice, not everybody wants it or needs it, but it helps. Then that'll come later if you're doing something that's true and exciting to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's very, very encouraging. So I believe that was the final question that we had. I want to thank both of you so much for your contribution tonight. Thank you for sharing your work. Thank you for sharing your art. And I appreciate the dialogue so much.
Thank you so much, Elle.
Thank you, Al.
Absolutely. I also want to thank all of the attendants. This concludes our program tonight. For the audience's information, if you are interested in learning more about this topic, I just dropped Calvin and Chris's websites in the chat box. And please make sure to check out Calvin's book, Invasions, which we have in our library system. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Calvin.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, SPL, everybody.
Thank you, Elle. Thanks, SPL.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Have a great evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Stay in touch.